Good morning. We are going to start this discussion table called Atrocity and Museums, Representations of Violence and Memory. Today with us we will have short discussions. We were very ambitious with questions, just like the entire event has been. I'd like to read to you the questions that were the underlying questions for the talks of the different speakers. The first is, what is the pedagogic function of a narrative? What are the different artistic languages and their place in museum technology? The third one is political manipulations and official narratives of memory. Fourth, how an architectonic space of a museum can contribute to the purposes of recognition and redressal to victims. And fifth, what ethical museological criteria should guide the inclusion of memories and the discourses of perpetrators? The idea is not for each speaker to discuss the 5 questions, but based on the specificity of their experience, based on the characteristics of the projects that they have been supporting and leading, to focus more strongly on one of these questions. The dynamic will be as follows. There will be 10 minutes for each talk, and at the end, we would like to engage in a discussion based on your questions. We are quite tight in our schedule, so I'm the moderator and I'm also a speaker. So I will need to be moderated by someone else. Well, the order of talks, I'm going to start with my talk, then Denise, Roberto, Florencia, and Alice. And I will introduce them when the turn comes. So I'd like to start with my presentation. I'm Nubia Bello. I come from the National Center for Historical Memory. The museum I work at is a project. This museum does not exist yet. It is an undergoing project. There's social construction and also architectonic construction. As you can see, the museum is a legal mandate, and unlike many other museums, with other histories, this museum is part of a comprehensive redressal and attention law to the victims, and it fulfills 2 main roles that I would like to mention. One role is, through the museum, the state should fulfill its memory role. It is a task to strengthen historical memory through a museum. And most importantly, since it is in the framework of a law of redressal to the victims, it should contribute to the symbolic redressal of these victims. That's why the law clearly states that the museum should contribute to the dignification and recognition of the victims. So, this museum should contribute to collective memory, and it should bring insight into why violence has happened, what was the extent of violence, but at the same time, this museum should recognize victims. It should recognize the realities of their victimization as well as their proposals, expectations, and demands. We are talking about a museum that focuses on a concrete historical period, the violence of the past 60 years, where this museum needs to take care of a universe of victims which is very atypical in Latin American region. Almost 7 million victims and 11 different types of victimization. This museum caters for heterogeneous victims from different perpetrators, and also because of their ethnic condition and gender, political ideology, etc. So this exercise of building the museum encompasses a big area, the social and physical construction of the museum. In terms of the social construction, we mean the big social discussion that we need to engage in order to be able to build this museum. Because this museum has to fulfill a redressal function, there is a clear idea in our minds that we need to consult the victims. The museum needs to collect the expectations of the victims. This museum is the result of a big mobilization of the victims for memory in Colombia. This museum is the response to great pressure and demand that victims have historically been making, as well as the organizations of human rights. So this law that created this museum is a response to a huge social demand, pressure, and mobilization. So that's why this museum should cater for the expectations, claims, and protests of victims. By social construction, we mean listening to the victims from the different regions and listening to them, not just in terms of their stories, the stories that they want to be included in the museum, but also in terms of more concrete things like museographic contributions that they believe that should be at this museum, because that has been the result of their work as victims. And victims have insisted very much on the fact that not only should victims be recognized and not only should society find out of their victimization in the country, but also the causes of the war should be discussed, as well as the culprits of that armed conflict. It's a complex discussion process because armed conflict is still in place in our country. We are in the process of political negotiation, and there is high social polarization in my country. So as you can imagine, this discussion is not a fluent and calm discussion, but there are different stances at play as to how to name different things at the museum, what should appear at this museum. So it's a complex discussion, and maybe the main characteristics that we could say is that here what appears the most is lack of agreement rather than consensus. So this social discussion or social dialogue has been very interesting because it starts from the principle that as a national memorial center, we try to see how people are processing this memory and what sense they put on this. So it's very interesting. My country has many expressions of memory that are self-managed and are autonomous. There are many languages, there's drama, there's paintings, there's embroidered, there's 5 types of memory. There are many places of memory, many manifestations of memory, small community memorial museums. So we have the need to recognize, but not only recognize to see that this exists, but also to be able to learn and to collect what's already in place in the territories in this National Museum in Bogota. Here you can see some of the dynamics of this participative dialogue throughout the country, where there are Afro-Indigenous communities, women, young people, etc. What have we been able to define when we were doing this museologic exercise? First, to discuss the role of the museum. And we have 3 roles: a repairing function, which entails recognizing the victims and reestablishing their dignity; an insight role, which entails contributing knowledge; and a pedagogic role or educational role. And what are the topics or the themes? Well, there are 5. What happens, i.e., discussing the dimensions of the conflict, the causes and responsibilities, the damages and impacts caused by violence, dignity, resistance, and peace, and something that we have called memory in the present time. We have brought sense to each theme. What do we want the visitors to experience? What do we want to cause in them? as to what happened, we want to create indignation. This may seem strange, but we want to cause this feeling, because my entire generation, at least the past 2 generations, don't know what it means to live in a country that's not at war. We have experienced this history, and this long war, we naturalize it, and in a way, this long war prevents us from feeling indignation or from feeling awe or reaction. So this what happened wants to include or incorporate in the museum this dramatic impact of war in order to come to an agreement about the need to stop war. This agreement is not yet instilled in Colombian society because some people may think that it's not necessary to stop the war. As regards causes and responsibility, we don't aim to have a single script, but we want to raise questions and thought. As regards damages and impact, we want to instill sensitivity, the recognition of authority in terms of dignity and resistance. We want to share with people the peace initiatives in Colombia that go parallel with war. There are people who resist not just as an expression to survive, but also as an expression to try to build a different society, a democratic society amidst that conflict. And this idea of show resistance and dignity also aims to instill a feeling of hope in visitors and some type of understanding that it's also possible to find alternatives amidst war. As regards the present and the country that we want, when we talk about memory, the present time, we don't mean a museum that talks about the past, but a museum that's touching upon topics of present violence as well as and other topics besides political violence. So, the architectural proposal, well, I will leave aside. Whoever wants to discuss it, we can do so afterwards. It's gonna start being built next year, and it will be opened in 2018. So now we are going to introduce Denise Ledgard. Denise is a director of LUN, a memorial. She's a former director. It's a former director of LUN, which is a memorial place in Lima, Peru. She was the director there for 2 years, and she has a very good experience that she will share with us.
Thank you for the invitation. Even though in my presentation the University of Peru is mentioned, I am not the president of LUM. My tenure ended this year, but I would like to share with you my experience and leave some open questions for you to reflect upon. And it has to do with one of the questions we were asked, the position of the museum faced with the political tension. My exit from my position was quite drastic or dramatic, so I'm no longer under pressure, and I can express freely my feelings right now because I am not longer in that position. And our work also shows us that if you act wrongly, the results will also be wrong. But when you act correctly, results may also be wrong. So this is a very sensitive issue. We can talk about it later on, but that's the kind of feeling that I have today. I would like to share with you how we built this space. Unlike the Colombian case, we already had a building. We didn't know what we wanted to install in that building, but we already had the facilities. So I became the president 2 years ago, and we wanted to build the content of what we wanted to show and the message we wanted to convey on the part of the state. Now, to give you some background, I believe you already are aware of the internal armed conflict in Peru since the 80s, or from the 80s to the year 2000. This conflict still exists in some corners of the country. But as one of the conclusions of the Committee for Truth expresses, it was submitted in 2002, the armed conflict was probably the stage in our Republican history that was very strongly suffered by our people. But this gives us a dimension of the size, 6,000 to 8,000 direct victims. There is no official figure, and each group has different figures, and there is complexity ingrained in all this. But 68% of these people were undereducated. 75% of the fatal victims spoke the native languages like Quechua, and that is only 16% of the total population. Most of the victims were from peasants, 79%, and only 29% lived in rural areas. We have more than 15,000 missing people during the conflict. These figures are relative, of course, but I believe they give us an idea of where the conflict wrought havoc and who were the people that suffered it the most. In the Chilean or Argentine cases, we had a dictatorship, and there was clear violence by the state and abuse of human rights. In the case of Colombia and Peru, we have more complex considerations. And in specific case of Peru, the conflict arose when we recovered democracy. When we went back to democracy in 1980, that is when Shining Path movement emerged. So there is a series of causes that I will not deal with because we don't have enough time. But this is a process that doesn't arise from dialogue. It occurred haphazardly. So there is a donation from Germany. The president didn't want it. Vargas Llosa exerted some pressure. There were some political circumstances. And finally, we were awarded that grant for the project. What are the goals in this memorial place? There is a high-level commission appointed by the state, and in 2012, with the new administration, the commission, which is still in place, had four main objectives. One was to host the history of what had happened in the period starting in the 1980s, to serve as a space for reflection, analysis, and debate for our identity and history, to call upon everyone, and this makes us different from a memorial site, because we have a different role, particularly for young people who are not acquainted with the history of our country during those decades, and also generate a living space to face the problems and promote tolerance and respect for human rights. With the new administration and the new commission, the name has changed. It is called Place for Memory, Tolerance, and Social Inclusion. So it covers a wide spectrum, and it changes the nature of the purpose of this museum or place. The components are the construction of the physical works. Well, sometimes you start with the contents, other times with the building. When you have complex projects, I'm not sure if we would have been able to build the content if we hadn't had the building already in place. So we had already the building. I will show you a video so that you can understand what it is like. It is a documentation center. The exhibit rooms, there are permanent and temporary exhibits. There is an auditorium or conference room that is already working because we wanted to have some positioning, and we want to keep it open. And then we also have the educational component. The most interesting factor, or the most interesting fact in these 2 years, was a process of consultation. The content of the exhibit that will be shown in December, the permanent exhibit, is built based on a consultation process. There were more than 30 meetings in Lima, Ayacucho, and Satipo, the three regions that were most strongly affected. And we had different stakeholders like NGOs, officers, representatives of different state institutions. We have the conclusions on the website of the LUM. You can download the e-book because you will have a report of all meetings. So it's very interesting to see how that process worked. We also had focus groups with students, and the conclusions and reactions were very interesting. We also had a curator team to prepare the museum script with validation meetings, and we have the photographs and all the materials ready. So the e-book that you can download gathers these testimonials where you see the polarization or old polarizations have become places of exchange. So the polarizations have disappeared, in fact. So our approach, or the approach at this memorial site, as one of the authors said in the video, is to provide evidence. To provide evidence of what happened. It is important for people to prove what happened to them and also to remember. It is a place where several memories will coexist. These memories will not necessarily be in agreement or built on consensus, but they will be in dispute. The role of the state is a complex one. The state is a state that has not asked for forgiveness. I said that at an interview, and I was sacked the next day. So we need to talk about that. As long as the injuries are wide open, and as long as the state does not ask for forgiveness, we will have to continue rethinking about this. If we are going to have a museum like this, the state should be there to provide and protect this space and to allow people to own the space and reflect upon the topics. So curatorship has to do with memory in construction or memory in progress. It's not static or rigid. It is something that we build as we go along. The main aspect is not only talking about the victims, but mostly citizenship and democracy. In the Peruvian case, we understand that the emergence of violence, we understand that violence emerges as an attack on democracy, and building democracy is the only thing that will allow us to overcome violence. So it will tell a story in the most objective way possible, and it will address the main topics of violence based on local stories and testimonials of individuals. So one of the questions was how do we represent ourselves in the consultative process? We have a major native population that was affected in the Peruvian forest and also in some in the hilly area, in the hillsides. We don't want to resist anymore. We have a different present today. So the idea is to present the subject suffering the impact in the personal sphere. What did it mean to these people? What was the impact on their personal lives? And how did it translate into experiences with the community? I'll skip this. In one of the permanent exhibits, in one of the rooms, in two of the rooms, they are very powerful rooms. Room 3 and 4 talk about one people, many peoples, and one person, many persons. We are going to have an in-depth discussion of three different peoples. In one of them, the main perpetrator was the Shining Path. In the other one, the Peruvian army. And then the Yannick community, which suffered in this war of all against all, and they suffered a lot from this situation. And we will also talk about other sufferings and attacks, but these three in particular. So in the room that is called One Person, All Persons, this is the last video I will show, I promise, because I don't have any more time. But this is a demo of what we will have in that room. We will have full-size screens. You have to be strong because your father is dead. When I was told this, I felt desperate. It was a strong impact. I had been talking with this person early in the morning, and then when I went to see him, he had bullet injuries, 6 bullets in all. I felt he was still warm, his body. Well, that was where the bomb was installed. The bomb went off. I wanted to escape, but my leg was caught. We have 4 examples of the videos that we will, the testimonials, full-size representation of these people. You go into the room and you feel that they are talking to you. It is not just looking at testimony. They are talking to you, actually. They are telling us, you could have been one of us. This is what I was doing when it happened. The first one is the daughter of a mayor. The second one was persecuted in our country. He was the son of a politician. Then the third one is a mother that founded an association of mothers that are looking for their missing family. And finally, we have a representative of the army who was also injured in one of the operations. So based on personal testimonies, we would like to delve into the complexities of the conflict in the Peruvian case. The room has been in operation since June. Theater, music, and we have different. We also had a roving exhibit or a mobile exhibit, and we were just about to finish or to complete the entire process. I don't mind, I'm not in the president's office anymore, but I do wish it will continue.
Thank you very much, Denise. Now I give the floor to Roberto Fuertes, who's in charge of Parque por la Paz, Villa Grimaldi, Chile. Park for the Peace. Good morning. I'd like to share with you how I'm going to present what I have to tell you. I have taken into account what was discussed at this table, and I have something that I also would like to share with you, which I have prepared. First, I'm going to talk about the Villa Grimaldi Parque por la Paz, Park for the Peace. It was recovered 21 years ago. I'm going to talk about the site. It is the oldest reclaimed area of the Southern Cone. This is a site where the facts that I'm going to discuss happened. And in the second portion of my talk, I'm going to talk about a number of ideas and thoughts that have been in the discussion arena as to how much to tell and what to tell. Because we have, bear in mind, the idea of trauma. So this is what we would like to share with you, with a reflexive perspective, and also this museum project and how we came to it. This is the case of Chile, and I believe it is also true for the region. It has to do with this, the world of memory as heritage. We know that it has to do with research and investigation, with archives, with the heritage and everything that we have saved to date. This also leads to the decisions made by these institutions. These are complex decisions given the context that we have been listening to in the previous talks. So Villa Grimaldi existed already before the military coup of 1973, which lasted until 1989. This site was a colonial site with colonial inspiration. It was in the periphery of Santiago. It was more rural than today. Military and secret headquarters were built there. The military occupied public places like stadiums and also secret places and clandestine places, just like Grimaldi. This is one of the few pictures available from these times. The memory that we have been rebuilding is based on testimonials, because we don't have any photography or hard data about this place. So this is one of the few pictures of this site as it was. It is very close to military places. And the National Office of Intelligence operated here. It was made up of more than 30,000 people. And that's why we talk about terrorism of state. This is a drawing made by victims of Villa Grimaldi. Can you see in the picture this place with a house for public events? This used to be owned by a family. It had a concept of Italian villa before it was occupied. The brother of the owner was an ambassador in Italy, so there were ties with Italy, and that's why the name Villa Grimaldi. On the right, there are quarters for torture. Around 4,500 people were here. We have information about 233 people who went missing. There were also political prisoners. There were no bodies, so the bodies were removed from here. And as I showed earlier, there are quarters. These are drawings from a survivor. This survivor has explained to us and has given us information on how this place operated. Miguel Montesino is the name of this survivor. So torture rooms, torture quarters. So these drawings are drawings that come from the visual memory. We also want to rebuild the material memory. It's a large area, and before democracy came back, the place was devastated, and this is what this place was found in the 80s. How was it built as a memorial site? Through a social movement and human rights movement. They wanted to reclaim this place as a symbolic redress when democracy arrived. It was also used, and it's still being used, for different trials that took place when democracy came back. So these pictures are from the reclamation movement and human rights movement, both local and national, and it was very emblematic. This is in 1994 when they entered the place. And when that happened, the place, the state gave it to these movements. But it required that a corporation be set up. It has 500 members. Well, it operates bureaucratically according to the legislation of my country. And it is a museum that, and this entity manages the site. So when this site was reclaimed, the question was what to do with this site that had been devastated. There were many projects, and there's still no consensus about what to do here. One of the alternatives was to leave it as it was, as a symbol of what had happened. The second one was to rebuild these headquarters, and the third project was to have it as a site for peace, for world peace, like also a symbolic redress to victims, with using different healing elements like fire and water. This is an overhead view of the site. The symbolic architecture represents a never again cross inside the park, and it's highly symbolic. And then with subsequent memory studies, we have been working on semiotics and the different symbols of memory. So how to treat or deal with this space. This was built by a very young woman architect, and it was designed with a lot of symbolism in mind. For example, all the signage is on the floor, because the prisoners could only see the floor because they had bandages on their eyes. On the left, you see a forest of trees, and there is a path to walk amidst these trees. And in the middle, this the Square of Hope. It's a meeting point for visitors, and it goes across the two lines that I showed earlier. Memorial wall with the names. This is very much visited by the relatives and family of the people who were imprisoned here. A group of prisoners. It's important to mention this. This reproduces the most symbolic spaces, finding inspiration in sites that are related to the Holocaust. This is an emblematic place, a tower, where most of the missing people were there. And this cell shows also the different tortures that were inflicted there. So the family members organized an exhibit in a very small room. It's the memorial room where the relatives of the missing people prepared these showcases. It's a small room. There's lots of aspects that were taken into account, like lighting and conservation and so on. There are guided tours led by survivors. There are former prisoners that are close to Villa Grimaldi. And there's also models built by former prisoners. And there were focus groups and group activities done with them. In 2010, this took place. And subsequent to that, a very famous judge in Chile who dealt with emblematic cases found rails and tracks which were used to make these people disappear. And there was a contest that took place also to design this area. In 2010, there was an important change in the history of Villa Grimaldi. It was decided that there was going to be a museum built here. This was decided by the corporation. So a multidisciplinary team was called upon, and I started working on this team. And after a couple of years of broad participation and reflection, it was decided to create a memorial museum, but from a site museum perspective. So as a result of this, a visitor and conservation program was devised, and also a service center, like a documentation center, an oral archive with testimonials and key informants to rebuild the history of the place. And this led to greater visitors, to a great number of visitors coming to the site. There were roving exhibits, and this became a space that became open to society. So the questions and the issues that we have faced as regards how to address the representation of terror, in a way, and also the didactic of trauma. We have been trying to provide support on this. Ultimately, we have thought along these lines to see how these spaces talk to society. So, who should be telling the story? To recover the bonds with society based on two guiding concepts. The reasons so as not to forget, i.e. memory, and also solidarity and social living together, social coexistence. We are creating a new concept of museum without many prior experiences, trying to answer the questions of the present through the didactic of trauma, as I said earlier, as well as other dynamics. Thank you.
Florencia Battiti, who is part of the team, from the Argentine team, she will present an experience. Good morning, everyone. I will start sharing with you that the Park of Memory is not a museum. A Park of Memory has a monument or a memorial to the victims of state terror. In its dynamics, it includes some of the museum practices, but it is not a museum per se. And it does not have the enormous responsibility of building a single story or of what happened in Argentina regarding state terror. But we do tell a story. It does tell a story, and it uses in its dynamics museum practices, certain museum practices, but the main mission is not, as I have heard in this discussion, the institutional mission is not to be the site in the Argentine Republic to tell about the atrocities of state terror. So it does not carry such a burden. It would be impossible to gather all those stories in a single story, but it has some rules for its operation. So it is a memorial to terror of state terror victims. It is a pioneering project because it includes memory, and it is part of the city of Buenos Aires. In 1998, when the law was enacted, the national political administration was completely different. It was a neoliberal administration. It was impossible to think that this project would thrive at the national sphere back then because of the administration, the neoliberal administration. So they decided to do it at the city level. So that is why it was approached from the city perspective. What you see today is the 4-stone Patagonian stone monuments or blocks. In Argentina, we have always said that there are 30,000 missing people, but the organizers of this memorial that have been working for 15 years, or 17 years, in fact, they have tried to promote the management of this place. They decided that there would be 30,000 plates, but only 10,000 have names on them, as you can see. So it is not a museum, as I said, but it is located on the banks of the river Rio de la Plata, because it is a symbolic reference, the river. The human rights representatives wanted it to be located here because of the meaning of the significance of this place, and we need to represent the kind of situations that occurred during times of dictatorship. For Argentine people, the river has strong connotations. It was the anonymous tomb of many, many missing people because they were thrown into the river. As my colleagues were saying, if there is national consensus among Argentine people, unlike what Marta was saying in Colombia, they're still discussing whether the war should or should not stop. This caused an impact when I heard it. We are in a position to say that in Argentina we all agree we don't want any dictatorships any longer. We have said never again. I believe that there is a lot of tension around these issues, but it is possible to claim in this space, in this meeting space, that this is national consensus. We all agree on this. So it has the names that have been engraved of the people that disappeared or that are missing since the last dictatorship. It goes back to 1969, that is to say 7 years before the actual coup. I don't have the time to tell you why we decided upon that date, but based on strong discussions and profound discussions, it was decided that the start date for this memorial place would be the year of the Cordobazo event, which was another strong milestone in Argentine history rather than the start of the dictatorship. So it has the names of the missing people, the date since when they have been missing. I believe it is the only place where people can. So there are some references for other places where people can look for more information, for instance, about those people, personal details, their political affiliations and activism, and also provide information. So it's an exchange of information because the general public can also provide information so that these missing people will not be anonymous anymore. Here you can see one of the examples of one of the missing persons and all the personal details. So the monument of this memory park or memory site, talking in curatorship terms, there are two platforms of meaning. The park has an artistic heritage, which is a series of sculptures that are the result of an open and public bidding process or contest that was carried out in 1999. And there was a jury that selected two sculptures. and also the monument to state terrorism that was opened in 2007. So even though the project started in 1998, it has been gradually progressing, and society has been able to participate and to own the process of construction of this place. One of the platforms of meaning, or one of the cornerstones of the park, we call it the park for short, because it is this memorial park. That's why I'm saying the park. So based on this material heritage, we have the sculptures, the river, Rio de la Plata, and perhaps this is the permanent heritage at the site, and this is how we tell the stories based on different education programs that are articulated with visitors. I'm showing you some sculptures by Roberto Eisenberg, Oren Sanz, Claudia Fontes. These sculptures were submitted, were proposals for this international contest, and they were specifically designed for this project. Nicolás Guagnini and the street art group with urban interventions. They use traffic signs to tell a story about the background and consequences of the military dictatorship. And Norberto Gómez from Argentina, the Towers of Memory. So this would be the tangible assets and permanent assets that we have in this Parque de la Memoria, or memorial site. So thousands of missing people, repression, violence, many conflicts, tension, and some factual information that most of Argentine society agrees upon. Based on the exhibit space at this park, we also have a database, and based on all this, we have created an exhibit management project that attempts to bring to light the tension and the discussions, and to focus on the problems of our recent history that we have to talk about. So these are not only the victims and the families of victims, or the missing people and the direct victims that are talking to the public, but also the artists. The artists are the ones that call into question the recent history. And this has an enormous potential associated with it, as well as an enormous responsibility. Many people have said that contemporary art, because in the exhibit program we have contemporary art pieces. We produce our exhibits. In almost 90%, they are installations. We do not receive any packaged products. We produce those projects ourselves. Here we are have works by Dolores Cáceres. So when we started with the project, there were many voices against contemporary art, saying or claiming that contemporary art would not be able to address the problems of missing people and terror. So throughout the years, the park, articulating its discourse with other sites of terror, like the former ESMA site and other clandestine detention areas, this site shows that contemporary artists, when they do it seriously, but not solemnly, we work very seriously, but we are not solemn about it. They are fully aligned to address, or fully enabled to address, these problems. So that was showing another exhibit. Of course, contemporary art is able to address these kind of problems associated with state terror. Now, looking at my PowerPoint, I would like to say that in the case of Viola, Bill Viola is an artist of world renown, and many people had already seen his work in other shows and displays in other countries, so they were acquainted with his work. So Viola's exhibit, as all our exhibits, have or suffer a re-signification or revisiting the meaning of the works. So, to get to the room, you have to walk through the monument. You have to read the names. You need to be in touch with the river. After you have done all of that, after you have become sensitive to all that happened in our country, when you go across the door of the country room of this park, the room is called Country. So the artistic proposition will necessarily have a re-signifying purpose. So the curatorship was by Adriana Lauria, but we invited different curators to articulate their voices in the room at the park. This was also a decision of the management team. We don't want to be the ones that declare what kind of voice should be shown. There should be a dialogue of voices that are shown in the exhibit. We tried to articulate to present 4 shows or displays per year. It is not very ambitious, but we try to make it truly international. And we try to have an international and a regional show. Here you can see some Chilean pieces of cloth that we had in the park. And we also try to have 2 local projects during the year. So far we have had a wide range of topics and themes reflected on our shows. Here with Tomás Saraceno's project, it was curated by Inés and Javier, and their main premise was that the artists that would take part in the show had to be young artists that were born after the dictatorship, so as to see how young artists that had not had a direct experience with dictatorship, to explore how they would articulate this kind of memory in their exhibit in the room. We have performances. This is an example. Many of you may have seen this artist at the Malva Museum, but this proposal was shown at the park. And then we also had Jar, who is an international artist, who had a particular project for the park with an anthological show of his works shown in Chile before he moved to the United States. We have a short program or a limited program, but it is very ambitious in terms of the quality we want to have in our projects. Even though we are part of the government, of the city government, we are free to set our own agenda and to propose a male nude scene. Many people may have thought that this is not the right place to show this kind of image, but we work seriously. And this was Nuno Ramos' show. He's a Brazilian artist. But we also have local artists like Carlos Privnik, who worked on problems, dictatorship problems. So basically, we have worked with the 2 avenues of meaning, the monument or the memorial and the sculptures, which are in an open space, public space, and then an interesting agenda with some international artists like Caetano Veloso, Alfredo Char, and also regional problems and local problems. And also, we are focused on young people and driving or attracting the public. And we also understand that this green space should have some recreational aspect. We try to include that kind of public or that kind of audience, because maybe they are not aware what the purpose of the park is, but we try to integrate them as well, the people that go for a stroll or that, and we want them to be aware of recent history problems.
Bueno, gracias a Florencia.
Thank you, Florencia. And now we are going to have Alice's intervention. She's in charge of the September 11 Memorial and Museum of New York.
Hola. Good morning. The process of envisioning the 9/11 Memorial Museum in New York took 8 years and involved curators, educators, exhibition developers, landmark preservationists, architects, representatives of various constituencies, among them the family members of victims, survivors of the attacks, first responders, former recovery workers, and Lower Manhattan residents and business owners, all with a vested interest in what this museum should and would become. We also had exhibition designers and media producers charged with translating all of the various imperatives into a meaningful experience. All museums that document events defined by unimaginable personal loss and collective trauma will inevitably face challenges. The 9/11 Memorial Museum was no exception. The work to create this museum took place within the context of intense public scrutiny, divergent expectations of what would be appropriate to present at such an emotionally charged site, and the daunting responsibility to construct an exhibition narrative that would effectively codify a history not yet written. Among the core issues was how to balance commemoration with education. We've heard about that this morning, historical documentation, and the presentation of information that is both graphic and provocative. Adding to these complications were our temporal proximity to the event itself, the fact that key constituencies remain traumatized by grief, both personal and communal, and the extremely public and at times politicized planning process for a museum commemorating an event at once highly local, distinctly national, and essentially global. At every step, the design team had to negotiate each of those challenges and considerations. In addition, we had to create an experience that would make sense within a setting of palpable authenticity. The 9/11 Museum is not simply located at the site of the attacks. It is 7 stories below ground in a space defined by in situ historic remnants. Because federal preservation law mandated that those remnants be accessible to the public, the museum was built in a contemporary archaeological site whose authenticity of place had to be fully integrated with the narrative that would unfold within it. We saw this as an advantage rather than as a challenge. Where most museums are buildings that house artifacts, this would be a museum housed within an artifact. Because it's impossible to describe this museum in only a few minutes, I'm going to structure my comments around 4 key principles that inform the 9/11 Memorial Museum's fundamental character. And the first of these is authenticity. At sites of memory, authenticity is the critical element for achieving moral authority. Our location at Ground Zero demanded that we focus on what happened there. Establishing the authenticity of our narrative was the first order of business. Sorry, it's going backwards. After visitors enter the museum, they pass 2 80-foot-high columns that are known as tridents. These were originally on the east face of the North Tower, the original One World Trade Center. These columns formed the perimeter of the outside of the first 5 stories of the towers. From the outside of the museum, looking in, the tridents signal the power and presence of authentic artifacts inside. Within the museum atrium, visitors can look beyond them to see the new One World Trade building, suggesting a continuity between past and present. The authentic can be embodied by objects, location, or the voice of historic witness. We use all 3 to shape the visitor experience. Artifacts ranging from the monumental to the intimate connect visitors to the physical scale of both the site and the disaster, as well as the human scale of experience and loss. Our location at the heart of the original World Trade Center invites visitors to enter into history, both physically and metaphorically. Here, the voices of those who experienced the events, whether in the buildings, on the hijacked planes, or as witnesses, provide an immediacy of connection. And connection becomes our second principle. A memorial museum should facilitate a sense of connection with those who suffered an atrocity or a social injustice, whether as victims, survivors, or witnesses. It is essential that visitors see themselves in the story you are telling. This idea directly informed the design of our introductory exhibition, the slide you see now, titled We Remember. It is estimated that 1/3 of the world's population, nearly 2 billion people in 2001, watched the events of 9/11 simultaneously, either as they unfolded in real time or during the repeated broadcasts that afternoon and evening. Those of us who lived through that day are in some sense experts in this subject matter based on our own experience and memories. In We Remember, instead of having a conventional curatorial voice describing the global experience of 9/11, we invite our visitors to hear what it was like from the real people speaking with the authority of their own experience. As visitors move through this global map that actually fractures into 6 panels, they listen to people from around the world remembering where they were when they first heard about the attacks. Hearing memories spoken in 28 languages, visitors enter into a human drama that feels at once universal and deeply personal, as they are pulled forward into the physical space of the museum and the narrative space of the story. Which brings us to the third principle, storytelling. The 9/11 Museum's dynamic blend of architecture, archaeology, history, and commemoration creates an indelible encounter with the stories of the attacks and their aftermath. The experience reminds visitors that history is not an abstraction, but rather a compilation of lived narratives that weave into collective memory. As a storytelling museum, our focus is not so much on historians' interpretation of history, but rather on the human experience of this historical event. The museum's 2 core exhibitions are located at bedrock, 70 feet below ground, 7 stories, allowing visitors to be in the very space where the Twin Towers once stood. In Memoriam, the memorial exhibition is located on the actual footprint of the South Tower. The exhibition commemorates the 2,983 men, women, and children killed in the 9/11 attacks, as well as the bombing of the World Trade Center in February 1993. The historical exhibition, located on the footprint of the North Tower, examines the day of the attacks, what preceded them, and how 9/11 continues to shape our world. In that memorial exhibition, portraits line all 4 walls, floor to ceiling. Surrounded by the faces and names of those who were so senselessly killed, visitors experience an immediate understanding about the enormity of the loss. The number 2,983 is no longer an abstraction. These 4 walls are made up of people, and as we look at their faces and names, we recognize that they are a cross-section of humanity. Quite simply, they are all of us, ages 2.5 to 85, from over 90 nations, workers in every sector of the economy. Using touchscreen tables, visitors are able to call up any one of the individuals to learn more about them. And inside an intimate space at the center of the gallery, we remember each of these people for how they lived their lives rather than for how they died. Individual profiles, each running about a minute in length, are projected on the walls of the room, where family members, friends, former colleagues, and others have recorded remembrances of their loved ones. We have excerpted brief audio clips so that visitors are introduced to these people by those who knew them best. The memories they share are exactly like the stories we tell each other about the people we love. The stories can be funny, poignant, sometimes irreverent, but they are always very real and surprisingly familiar. In the historical exhibition, we make use of all forms of new media in the service of storytelling. Voicemail messages, emails, cockpit voice recordings, and radio transmissions provide an unparalleled sense of being inside the story. In intimate spaces that we call audio alcoves, visitors listen to first-person accounts of escape and evacuation and radio transmissions from first responders that day. Among the most sensitive recordings are real-time messages and calls to 911 from those trapped within the buildings. And in the Flight 93 alcove, voicemail messages left for loved ones by passengers and crew aboard the hijacked flight. Our use of these clips demanded careful consideration of our visitors' emotional thresholds. When is listening to the recording of someone's final words in the public space of a museum appropriate? When does historical documentation violate individual privacy and dignity? These questions were at the heart of every decision made.
They're tired, carrying all this equipment, and I'm wondering, are these men going to get out of this building?
Battalion 7, Battalion 9. Battalion 9 to Battalion 7. These stairway walls have been compromised on 73 and 74. Yeah, 10-4. We're on 71. We're coming up behind you.
There were a lot of firefighters in the stairwell, and you could see that they knew something, that it was dangerous. Those people were concentrated, focused on doing that job. They were going up to their death, and I was walking down to live.
So you get the idea. It's this sequence of actual testimony or archival audio that creates the story. We have 4 of these alcoves, and there are 5 different programs in each alcove. The final principle is engagement. A museum dedicated to commemoration and education cannot merely testify to what happened. It must also provide inspiration and the opportunity for response. In telling the story of the recovery at Ground Zero, we not only track the 9 months it took to search for human remains and ultimately to clear millions of tons of debris from the site. We tell the equally important story of 9/12, epitomized by acts of public service and volunteerism that significantly contributed to the cleanup and recovery efforts. That spirit of generosity, born of shared grief and a fundamental recognition of shared humanity, becomes a model for how to live in an interconnected world. When visitors exit the historical exhibition, they arrive in an enormous space called Foundation Hall. At its center is the 36-foot-high last column, the very last piece of Twin Tower steel to be removed from the World Trade Center site at the end of the recovery in May 2002. Covered with messages, missing posters, mass cards, and memorabilia, this totem of recovery was brought out of the site on a flatbed truck, covered in an American flag, escorted by honor guard. And today in the museum, it stands tall once again. Providing the dramatic backdrop is a monumental portion, 60 feet by 60 feet high, of the slurry wall, the original retaining wall, built to hold back the Hudson River when the World Trade Center was first under construction in the late 1960s. On 9/11, as 1.8 million tons of debris crashed into the site, the slurry wall was severely damaged. Had it breached, the disaster in Lower Manhattan would have been even more unimaginable, but it held. And in holding, the slurry wall has become a symbol of strength, fortitude, resilience, and endurance. Here in the museum is both a literal foundation of what was once here and a metaphoric foundation for what we can now build. As visitors move toward the escalator that will take them up from bedrock, they pass a final piece of World Trade Center steel. Next to it are kiosks where visitors can sign their names, make an observation, or voice a promise. The words they write appear on a map projected onto the adjacent area of the slurry wall. Their names and words emerge from where that person comes from. So, for example, if I were to write, "Always remember," the words would appear to be coming out of the area near New York City. The map is the very same map visitors saw at the head of the ramp, the global map that fractured on the morning of 9/11. And here, the map is now coherent and whole once again, but what is holding it together are all of us and the promises we make. Thank you.